Millionaire took his secretary to his ex's wife wedding, and what she did was unbelievable. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Rachel Turner was organizing files in her office when Ethan Carlisle stormed in, his face red with anger. She knew that look. Her boss had just received some bad news, and as his secretary for the past 5 years, she was usually the first to hear about it. "Can you believe this?" Ethan slammed a cream-colored envelope on her desk. It was an invitation to Victoria's wedding, his ex-wife who had left him for James Thornton, one of his biggest business rivals. Rachel picked up the invitation carefully. The paper was expensive, with gold lettering announcing the union of Victoria Bennett and James Thornton. The wedding was scheduled for next month at the Grand Plaza Hotel, the most exclusive venue in the city. "She's doing this on purpose," Ethan paced back and forth in Rachel's small office. "Inviting me to watch her marry that snake Thornton. She knows exactly what she's doing." Rachel had been there through Ethan and Victoria's messy divorce. She'd seen how Victoria had dragged Ethan's name through the mud, claiming he was too focused on his business empire to be a good husband. Then, barely 3 months after the divorce was final, Victoria had started dating James Thornton. "Maybe it's best not to go," Rachel suggested, trying to be practical as always. "You have that business trip to Chicago that week anyway." Ethan stopped pacing and looked at Rachel with a strange gleam in his eyes. "No, I have a better idea. I'm going to that wedding and you're coming with me as my date." Rachel nearly choked on her coffee. "Mr. Carlisle, I don't think that's appropriate. I'm your secretary." "Exactly," Ethan said, becoming more excited about his plan. "Victoria always looked down on my employees. She hated how much time I spent at the office. Having you there as my date will drive her crazy." Rachel felt her stomach sink. She'd always prided herself on being professional, on keeping her private life separate from work. Plus, she knew she wasn't the type of woman Ethan usually dated. At 35, she was practical and plain, preferring sensible clothes and minimal makeup. She didn't belong in the glittering world of high society that Ethan and Victoria lived in. "Sir, I really don't think—" "I'll double your Christmas bonus," Ethan interrupted. "Plus, I'll buy you whatever dress you need for the wedding. Come on, Rachel. I need someone I can trust there with me." Rachel looked at her boss of 5 years. She'd seen him through countless business deals, late-night meetings, and personal crises. She knew he was hurting, even if he tried to hide it behind his anger and schemes for revenge. "Fine," she said finally, "but I have conditions. First, this is strictly professional. Second, I choose my own dress. And third, if I feel uncomfortable at any point, I can leave." Ethan grinned, looking more like his old self than he had in weeks. "Deal. You won't regret this, Rachel. We'll show Victoria and James that they didn't break me." As Rachel watched Ethan stride back to his office with renewed energy, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just agreed to something that would change everything. She'd spent years keeping her life organized and predictable, maintaining clear boundaries between her professional and personal life. Now she was about to step into a drama she'd only observed from the sidelines. That evening, as Rachel drove home to her modest apartment, she thought about what she'd gotten herself into. She'd need to find a dress suitable for what would surely be the society wedding of the year. She'd have to learn how to navigate the subtle warfare of the upper class. And most challenging of all, she'd have to figure out how to be Ethan Carlisle's date without letting her long-buried feelings for him complicate things. Because the truth was, Rachel had been half in love with her boss for years. She'd buried those feelings deep, knowing nothing could ever come of them. Ethan dated beautiful, sophisticated women like Victoria. He saw Rachel as his reliable secretary, nothing more. She'd made peace with that long ago. But now, pretending to be his date, being close to him in a way she'd never allowed herself to imagine, it was dangerous territory. Rachel knew she was walking into an emotional minefield where her heart could easily become collateral damage in Ethan's war with his ex-wife. Still, she'd agreed, and Rachel Turner always kept her word. She would help Ethan through this wedding, maintain her professional dignity, and hopefully emerge with her heart intact. Little did she know that this wedding would set in motion events that would turn her carefully ordered world upside down. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of wedding preparations. Rachel had never spent so much time shopping for a single outfit in her life. After visiting 5 different stores, she finally found the perfect dress, a deep blue silk gown that was elegant without being flashy. It cost more than she usually spent on clothes in 6 months, but this was a special occasion. What Rachel didn't expect was running into Victoria at the salon, where she went to get her hair styled for the wedding. She was sitting in the chair getting a trim when Victoria swept in with her usual entourage of friends. "Well, well," Victoria's voice carried across the salon. "If it isn't Ethan's little secretary, I heard he's bringing you to my wedding. How desperate." Rachel met Victoria's eyes in the mirror. "Hello, Victoria. Congratulations on your engagement." Victoria walked over, her designer heels clicking on the tile floor. "Let's be clear about something, Rachel. I know what Ethan's trying to do. Using you to make me jealous? Please, you're not exactly his type. You're just a secretary who does his paperwork and brings him coffee." Rachel felt her face flush, but kept her voice steady. "You're right about one thing, Victoria. I do handle Ethan's paperwork, including the divorce settlement you signed last year. Interesting reading, especially the part about the prenup with James." Victoria's perfectly made-up face paled slightly. Rachel knew she'd hit a nerve. The prenup with James was much stricter than the one Victoria had signed with Ethan. If this marriage failed, Victoria would walk away with almost nothing. "You little—" Victoria started, but Rachel cut her off. "Have a lovely wedding, Victoria. I'm sure it will be exactly what you deserve." After Victoria stormed out, Rachel's hands were shaking so badly she could hardly hold her phone. She hadn't meant to reveal that she knew about the prenup, but Victoria's words had struck too close to home. They were the same doubts that had been keeping Rachel awake at night. That evening, Ethan called her at home, something he'd never done before. "I heard about what happened at the salon," he said. "Victoria called to complain about you, said you threatened her." Rachel's heart sank. "Mr. Carlyle, I'm sorry if I overstepped." "Rachel," Ethan interrupted, laughing. "Stop apologizing. This is the first time I've heard Victoria sound rattled in years. Whatever you said to her, it was brilliant." His approval warmed her heart, even though she knew it shouldn't. "Sir, there's something you should know. The real reason Victoria was upset is because I mentioned her prenup with James. I shouldn't have known about it, but when I was organizing the legal files, you found a copy," Ethan finished. "That's why she's really angry. Because you know she's trapped herself in an even worse deal with James than she had with me." He paused. "Rachel, you've seen me through the worst year of my life. You don't have to call me Mr. Carlyle outside of work. Call me Ethan." I'll try," Rachel said, flustered by this new intimacy. "Was there anything else you needed?" "Yes, actually. I'm having dinner with some potential investors tomorrow night. Would you come with me? Consider it a practice run for the wedding. Plus, you're better at remembering people's names than I am." Rachel knew she should say no. This was exactly the kind of boundary crossing she'd been trying to avoid. But somehow she found herself saying, "What time should I be ready?" After she hung up, Rachel sat on her couch, hugging a pillow to her chest. She was playing with fire, and she knew it. The dinner tomorrow, the wedding next week, she was getting too close to Ethan, letting the lines between professional and personal blur dangerously. But for the first time in years, Rachel was tired of being careful. Victoria's words at the salon had stung because they contained a grain of truth. Rachel had always played it safe, stayed in her lane, kept her feelings locked away. Maybe it was time to take a risk, even if it meant getting hurt. She got up and went to her closet, where the blue silk dress hung in its garment bag. Next to it was a simpler black dress she could wear to dinner tomorrow. Rachel touched the fabric gently, wondering if she was ready for the changes that were coming. In her 5 years as Ethan's secretary, she'd watched him date socialites and models, seen him marry and divorce Victoria, observed his triumphs and failures from a safe distance. Now she was about to step into his world, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. Across town, in his luxury penthouse apartment, Ethan was having similar thoughts. He stood at his window, looking out at the city lights, thinking about Rachel's confrontation with Victoria. He'd always known Rachel was competent. It was why he'd kept her as his secretary for so long. But today she'd shown a different side of herself, a strength he'd never fully appreciated before. He thought about how she'd stayed late during his divorce, bringing him dinner when he forgot to eat, quietly handling calls from reporters, and rearranging his schedule so he could meet with his lawyers. She'd been his rock during the worst time of his life, and he'd never really thanked her. Ethan picked up his phone, started to call her again, then put it down. He'd already crossed one boundary by calling her at home tonight. Better to wait until tomorrow. But as he got ready for bed, he found himself looking forward to dinner with Rachel more than he'd expected. Rachel smoothed down her black dress as she waited in the lobby of La Maison, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. She'd arrived early, as usual, going over the names and backgrounds of the investors who would be joining them. The maitre d' had given her a slightly dismissive look when she first walked in, but she was used to that in places like this. "Rachel?" She turned at the sound of Ethan's voice and almost didn't recognize him. Instead of his usual business suit, he was wearing a casual blazer and dark jeans. He looked younger somehow, more relaxed. "You look—" Ethan paused, searching for words. "Different. Good different." Rachel felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. You look nice too." "Mr. Carlyle." A loud voice interrupted their moment. James Thornton was walking toward them, Victoria clinging to his arm. Of all the restaurants in the city, they had to be here tonight. Rachel watched Ethan's jaw tighten. "James, Victoria, what a surprise." "We're celebrating," Victoria announced, holding up her left hand to show off her massive engagement ring. "The wedding plans are coming along perfectly. I assume you're still coming." Her eyes slid dismissively over Rachel. "Both of you?" Before Ethan could respond, Rachel stepped forward. "Of course we are. In fact, we were just discussing what to get you as a wedding gift. Any suggestions, Victoria? Perhaps a nice frame for your prenup?" James's grip on Victoria's arm tightened slightly. "We should go to our table," he said quickly. "See you at the wedding, Carlyle." After they left, Ethan turned to Rachel with admiration. "I've never seen anyone handle Victoria like that. Where did this side of you come from?" Rachel was saved from answering by the arrival of the investors. The dinner that followed was a blur of business talk and wine. Rachel found herself actually enjoying it, especially when she caught Ethan looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Later, as they waited for their cars outside the restaurant, Ethan said, "Let me drive you home, it's late." "I can take a cab," Rachel protested, but Ethan was already opening the door of his Mercedes for her. The drive to her apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Rachel watched the city lights blur past, aware of every breath, every small movement Ethan made beside her. "You surprised me tonight," he said finally, pulling up in front of her building. "You always surprise me lately." "Is that a good thing?" Rachel asked, her hand on the door handle. Ethan turned to look at her, his face serious in the dim light. "Yes, I think it is." He hesitated, then added, "Rachel, A tap on the window made them both jump. It was Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door walking her dog. She waved cheerfully, oblivious to the moment she'd interrupted. "I should go," Rachel said quickly. "Thank you for dinner and the ride." "Rachel," Ethan called as she got out, "about the wedding next week. Are you sure you're ready for what people might say?" She thought about Victoria's sneers, about the whispers that would follow them. "Are you? With you there, I think I can handle anything." Rachel couldn't sleep that night. She kept replaying the evening in her mind, the way Ethan had looked at her, what he might have been about to say in the car. She told herself not to read too much into it. This was all just preparation for their plan, their act at the wedding. But lying in her dark bedroom, Rachel couldn't deny that something had shifted between them. The careful walls she'd built over the years were crumbling, and she wasn't sure whether to be thrilled or terrified. Across town, Ethan was having his own sleepless night. He sat in his home office, a glass of scotch untouched beside him, thinking about Rachel. Not as his secretary, but as the woman who'd stood up to Victoria twice now, who'd made him laugh more tonight than he had in months. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Nice try bringing your secretary to dinner, but we both know you can do better." Ethan looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. For the first time since Victoria had left him, he was starting to think maybe she'd done him a favor. Maybe he'd been looking for the wrong things, valuing the wrong qualities in the people around him. The wedding was a week away, a week to figure out what he really wanted and whether he was brave enough to risk everything, his professional relationship with Rachel, his carefully rebuilt dignity, to get it. Little did either of them know that the real drama was yet to begin. Victoria and James had plans of their own, and Rachel and Ethan's growing closeness was about to be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. 3 days before the wedding, Rachel was working late at the office when she overheard voices coming from the conference room. She recognized James Thornton's voice immediately. "Everything's in place," James was saying. "Once Victoria and I are married, we'll announce the merger. Ethan won't know what hit him." Rachel froze outside the door. She shouldn't be listening, but she couldn't make herself walk away. "The board is already on our side," another voice said. It was Richard Kane, one of Ethan's senior executives. "They think Ethan's been distracted lately, making bad decisions. Once the merger is announced, we'll call for a vote of no confidence. He'll be out as CEO before he knows what's happening." "And Victoria?" Richard asked. "She's sure Ethan won't suspect anything." James laughed. "She's got him exactly where she wants him. He's so busy trying to show her he's moved on with that plain little secretary of his, he can't see what's right in front of him. Rachel's hands were shaking as she hurried back to her desk. She had to tell Ethan, but when she reached for her phone, she hesitated. Would he believe her? And if he did, what would he think when he found out she'd been eavesdropping? Before she could decide, her phone rang. It was Margaret Carlyle, Ethan's mother. "Rachel, dear," Margaret's cultured voice came through the line. "I need to speak with you about this situation with my son." "Mrs. Carlyle, Please let me finish. I've always liked you, Rachel. You've been good for Ethan's business, but accompanying him to Victoria's wedding? It's inappropriate, you must know that." Rachel felt her face burn. "With all due respect, Mrs. Carlyle, that's between Ethan and me." "Is it?" Margaret's voice turned sharp. "Let me be clear. If you continue with this charade, you'll only end up hurting Ethan and yourself. You don't belong in his world, Rachel. We both know that." After Margaret hung up, Rachel sat at her desk fighting back tears. Everything was spinning out of control. She had to tell Ethan about James's plan, but now she wondered if Margaret was right. Maybe she was in over her head. The elevator dinged, and Ethan walked in, looking tired but handsome in his dark suit. "You're here late," he said, then noticed her face. "Rachel, what's wrong?" She took a deep breath. "We need to talk. I overheard something tonight." Rachel told him everything. James's plan for the merger, the board's betrayal, everything except her conversation with Margaret. She watched his face change as he absorbed the news. Anger and hurt warring in his expression. "Those backstabbing—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I should have known Victoria was still trying to destroy me. And Richard Kane, I trusted him. What are you going to do?" Ethan's face hardened. "First, I'm going to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Then, I'm going to that wedding and watching Victoria's face when all her plans fall apart." "Do you think that's wise?" Rachel asked. "Maybe we should just stay away from the wedding altogether." "No," Ethan said firmly. "I need you there with me, Rachel. I can't do this alone." He reached for her hand across the desk. "Unless, do you want to back out? I'd understand." Rachel thought about Margaret's words, about James's dismissive comment about the plain little secretary. But then she looked at Ethan's face, saw the trust and something else in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, squeezing his hand. "We'll face them together." That night, as Rachel drove home, her phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Coffee tomorrow, we need to talk about Ethan. There are some things you should know." Rachel stared at the message for a long time before responding. Noon, the cafe on 5th. She knew it was probably a trap, but she had to know what Victoria was planning. As she got ready for bed, Rachel wondered what other secrets would come to light before this wedding was over. At his penthouse, Ethan was on the phone with his lawyers preparing for tomorrow's board meeting. But his mind kept drifting to Rachel, her loyalty, her strength. When had his secretary become the person he trusted most in the world? He picked up his phone to call her, then remembered the way she'd looked when he first came into the office tonight. There was something else bothering her, something she hadn't told him. He'd seen it in her eyes when she squeezed his hand. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, Victoria and James were also awake, making plans of their own. "Everything's falling apart," Victoria said, pacing their bedroom. "That little secretary knows too much." James pulled her into his arms. "Calm down, I have a plan. By the time the wedding's over, Ethan Carlyle won't know what hit him, and his precious Rachel, she'll wish she'd never stepped out of her place." The cafe on 5th Street was busy when Rachel arrived at noon the next day. Victoria was already there, looking perfectly put together in a designer suit. A large manila envelope sat on the table in front of her. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Victoria said, pushing a coffee cup toward Rachel. "Milk, no sugar. That's how you take it, right? I remember from all those late nights you spent at the office with my husband." Rachel sat down, ignoring the coffee. "What do you want, Victoria?" "To help you." Victoria slid the envelope across the table. "These are photos taken over the last 5 years. You and Ethan working late, having dinner in his office, getting into his car." She paused. "They paint quite a picture." Rachel's heart pounded as she looked at the photos. They were innocent moments, but arranged this way, they seemed suspicious, sordid even. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing, yet." Victoria smiled. "But imagine these photos leaked to the board right before they vote on Ethan's future. The scandal would ruin him. And you," she leaned forward, "unless you do the right thing and stay away from the wedding." Meanwhile, across town, Ethan stood before his company's board of directors. The emergency meeting had been called for 9 a.m., and he'd spent the night preparing with his lawyers. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I've called this meeting because I've discovered evidence of conspiracy and betrayal within this company. Richard Kane shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ethan, I think you're overreacting. Am I? Ethan played a recording. Rachel had thought to record the conversation she'd overheard on her phone. The board members listened in shocked silence to James and Richard discussing their plans. I trusted all of you, Ethan said when the recording finished. I built this company from nothing, and this is how you repay me, by plotting with my enemies? It's just business, Richard protested. The merger with Thornton Industries makes sense. The merger is dead, Ethan cut him off. And so is your career here, Richard. Security will escort you out. As for the rest of you, he looked around the room. I want your resignations on my desk by the end of the day. Back at the cafe, Rachel stared at Victoria. You really haven't changed, have you? Still trying to control everyone and everything? I'm trying to help you, Victoria insisted. Ethan's using you to get back at me. Once the wedding's over, he'll drop you like yesterday's news. Save yourself the humiliation. Rachel stood up, leaving the envelope untouched. You know what your problem is, Victoria. You think everyone's as calculating and cold as you are. But some of us actually care about Ethan. Not his money, not his power. Him. Oh my God, Victoria's eyes widened. You're in love with him, aren't you? You actually think you have a chance with him. She laughed. Oh, honey, I almost feel sorry for you. Rachel's phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Board meeting over. Need to see you. Important. Keep your photos, Victoria, Rachel said. And your fake concern. I'll see you at the wedding. She walked out of the cafe with her head held high, but her hands were shaking. Victoria's words had hit too close to home. Was she fooling herself? Was she setting herself up for heartbreak? When Rachel arrived at the office, Ethan was waiting in her doorway. We did it, he said, grinning. You should have seen their faces when I played that recording. Richard Kane practically ran out of the building. That's wonderful, Rachel said, trying to sound normal. I'm glad it worked out. Ethan's smile faded. What's wrong? Did something happen? I met with Victoria, Rachel admitted. She told him about the photos, the threats, everything except Victoria's comments about Rachel's feelings for him. Ethan's face darkened with anger. I'll kill her. She thinks she can threaten you? After everything else she's done? It's fine, Rachel said quickly. She can't hurt me. Yes, she can, Ethan said softly. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to touch her cheek. Rachel, I need to tell you something. Ethan! Margaret Carlyle's voice rang through the office. We need to talk about this board meeting. What were you thinking? Rachel stepped back quickly, her cheek burning where Ethan had touched it. I should go. You need to talk to your mother. Rachel, wait. But she was already walking away, her heart pounding. She couldn't let herself believe in moments like that. Victoria was right about one thing. This wasn't Rachel's world. She didn't belong here, in this dramatic saga of power and revenge. 2 days until the wedding. 2 days to get through this, to help Ethan face his enemies, to protect her heart from breaking. But as Rachel gathered her things to leave the office, she wondered if it was already too late for that. In his office, Ethan faced his mother's anger about the board meeting, but his mind was on Rachel. He'd seen something in her eyes today. Fear, hurt. He didn't understand what was happening between them anymore. All he knew was that the thought of her being threatened by Victoria filled him with a rage he'd never felt before. And somewhere across the city, James Thornton smiled as he received a text. Everything's ready for the wedding. Ethan and his secretary won't know what hit them. The evening before the wedding, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, staring at the blue silk dress hanging on her closet door. Tomorrow, everything would change, one way or another. Her phone had been buzzing all day with texts from Ethan, but she hadn't answered any of them. She needed time to think. A knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, she found Margaret Carlyle standing there. Mrs. Carlyle, how did you find where you live? I know everything about the people in my son's life. Margaret swept into the apartment, looking oddly out of place in her expensive clothes. We need to talk, Rachel. About tomorrow. There's nothing to talk about, Rachel said firmly. I'm going to the wedding with Ethan. Margaret pulled an envelope from her purse, different from Victoria's, but similar enough to make Rachel's stomach clench. Do you know what's in here? A check for $500,000. Rachel's mouth went dry. What? It's yours. All you have to do is leave, tonight. No explanations, no goodbye. Just disappear. Margaret's face softened slightly. I'm not being cruel, dear. I'm trying to save both you and Ethan from making a terrible mistake. You think I can be bought? Rachel's voice shook with anger. Everyone can be bought. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Margaret set the envelope on Rachel's coffee table. Think about it. This is enough money to start a new life somewhere else, away from all this drama, this world that isn't yours. After Margaret left, Rachel sat staring at the envelope. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Ethan. Please talk to me. I need to see you before tomorrow. Across town, Ethan was pacing his penthouse when his phone rang. It was Richard Kane. What do you want? Ethan snapped. To warn you, Richard said. James and Victoria, they're planning something for tomorrow, something big. I don't know all the details, but it's not just about the company anymore. Why are you telling me this? Because, despite what you think, I did respect you once. And what they're planning, it's wrong. They want to destroy you, Ethan, and they're going to use Rachel to do it. Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried calling Rachel again, but still no answer. Finally, he grabbed his keys. He had to see her, had to warn her. Meanwhile, at the Grand Plaza Hotel, Victoria was having her final wedding dress fitting when James burst into the room. You need to see this, he said, holding up his tablet. On the screen was a news article about to go live the next day. The headline read, Corporate Scandal, CEO's Secretary Reveals All. Victoria scanned the article, her eyes widening. Is this real? Did she actually say these things? Does it matter? James smiled. By the time Ethan sees this tomorrow, his reputation will be in shreds. And your little secretary friend? Her career will be over. I almost feel bad for her, Victoria mused. She really does love him, you know. I saw it in her eyes today. Love is for fairy tales, James said dismissively. This is business. The night grew darker as storm clouds gathered over the city. Rachel was still sitting in her darkened apartment when someone knocked on her door again. This time, it was Ethan. You haven't been answering your phone, he said, stepping inside. His eyes fell on the envelope on the coffee table. What's that? Your mother's attempt to buy me off, Rachel said quietly. $500,000 to disappear before the wedding. Ethan's face hardened. I'm so sorry, Rachel. My mother, Victoria, all of them. They're trying to control everything, everyone, but they can't control us. Can't they? Rachel stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. Maybe they're right, Ethan. Maybe I don't belong in your world. Look at everything that's happened just because I agreed to go to this wedding with you. That's not... Ethan stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Rachel, please look at me. She turned, and the look in his eyes made her heart stop. You want to know why I really asked you to come to the wedding, he said softly. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Victoria jealous. It was because you're the only person I trust, the only person who's never let me down. Ethan, I've been such a fool, he continued, stepping closer. All these years, you've been right there, taking care of everything, taking care of me, and I never saw what was right in front of me. Thunder crashed outside as rain began to fall. Rachel could hardly breathe as Ethan moved closer still. Tell me to stop, he whispered. Tell me this isn't what you want. Before she could answer, both their phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. Ethan looked at his screen and his face went white. What is it? Rachel asked. They're going to destroy us, Ethan said grimly. Both of us. Tomorrow at the wedding. Lightning flashed, illuminating their faces as they stood together in Rachel's darkened apartment, the storm raging outside matching the turmoil of their hearts. The wedding was hours away, and everything they'd built, their careers, their relationship, their lives, hung in the balance. The morning of Victoria's wedding dawned bright and clear, the previous night's storm leaving everything looking fresh and clean. If only Rachel's thoughts were as clear. She'd barely slept, torn between Ethan's almost confession and the looming threat of whatever Victoria and James had planned. Her phone was flooded with news alerts. The article hadn't dropped yet, but business reporters were hinting at a major scandal involving Carlyle Enterprises. Rachel's hands shook as she did her makeup, remembering Richard Kane's warning about using her to destroy Ethan. A text from Ethan lit up her phone. My driver will pick you up at 10. Whatever happens today, we face it together. At the Grand Plaza Hotel, Victoria stood in the bridal suite, surrounded by flowing white fabric and chattering bridesmaids. But her mind was on her phone, waiting for the signal from James that would set their plan in motion. Everything's ready, James told her when he called. The article goes live just as you're walking down the aisle. Ethan's face when he sees it. Wish I could take a picture. And Rachel? Victoria asked, surprising herself by feeling a twinge of guilt. Collateral damage, James said coldly. She should have stayed in her place. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his penthouse office making calls. He'd been up all night, trying to get ahead of whatever storm was coming, but every contact, every favor he called in, led nowhere. James had covered his tracks well. A soft knock at his door made him look up. It was his mother. "I suppose you're here to lecture me again," he said tiredly. Margaret Carlyle looked at her son with concern. "I'm here to tell you that Rachel didn't take the money." "I know. Do you love her?" The question hung in the air. Ethan thought about all the years Rachel had been by his side, her quiet strength, her unwavering loyalty. How had he been so blind? "Yes," he said finally. "I think I do." "Then you're both going to need this." Margaret placed a USB drive on his desk. "I had my own investigator looking into James and Victoria. What's on here, it changes everything." At 10 a.m. sharp, a sleek black car pulled up outside Rachel's apartment building, but when she got in, she found not just the driver, but Ethan himself waiting for. "You look beautiful," he said softly, taking in her blue silk dress. "Ethan, about last night—" "Wait," he interrupted, pulling out the USB drive. "Before anything else, you need to see this." He opened his laptop and played a video file. Rachel's eyes widened as she watched. It was security footage from James's office, showing him and Victoria discussing their real plan, not just to take over Ethan's company, but to embezzle millions before orchestrating its collapse. "They're not just after revenge," Ethan explained. "They're planning to steal everything and flee the country right after the wedding. The scandal they're about to unleash about us, it's just a smokescreen. We have to stop them." "We will, but we have to be smart about it." Ethan took her hand. "Rachel, before we go in there, I need you to know something. Last night, when I came to your apartment, what I was trying to say..." The car stopped in front of the Grand Plaza Hotel. Through the tinted windows, they could see photographers and guests arriving, an army of white uniformed staff directing traffic. "Tell me later," Rachel said, squeezing his hand. "Right now, we have a wedding to crash." They stepped out of the car into bright camera flashes. Rachel heard the whispers start immediately, about Ethan bringing his secretary, about how inappropriate it was. But with Ethan's hand on her back, she held her head high. In the hotel lobby, they ran into James's best man, looking flustered. "Mr. Thornton wants to see you," he told Ethan. "Privately. He says it's urgent." Ethan looked at Rachel. "I'll be right back." "Be careful," she whispered. As soon as Ethan was gone, Victoria appeared as if by magic, still in her dressing robe. "Walk with me," she commanded Rachel. "There's something you should see before the ceremony begins." Rachel followed Victoria into a quiet hallway, her heart pounding. She didn't know that on the other side of the hotel, James was showing Ethan a very different version of the security footage, one doctored to make it look like Rachel had been the one helping them plan Ethan's downfall all along. The stage was set. In 30 minutes, Victoria would walk down the aisle. In 31 minutes, the scandal would break. And in 32 minutes, everyone would have to choose where their true loyalties lay. Victoria led Rachel into a small conference room, where a laptop was already open on the table. "Before we go any further," Victoria said, "I want you to see exactly what's about to happen." On the screen was the article that would soon go live, complete with photos of Rachel and Ethan together. But these weren't the innocent photos from before. These had been doctored to look intimate, inappropriate. Worse, there were emails, faked emails, that made it look like Rachel had been feeding company secrets to James and Victoria for months. "Why are you showing me this?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Because I'm giving you one last chance to walk away." Victoria's face was unusually serious. "Once this goes live, there's no going back. Your reputation will be ruined." Meanwhile, in another part of the hotel, James was showing Ethan the doctored security footage. "Your precious Rachel's been playing you for months," James said, smirking. "How does it feel to be betrayed by someone you trust?" But Ethan wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on something in the background of the video, a reflection in a window that showed the real footage being edited. "You know what your biggest mistake was," Ethan said quietly, "thinking you were the only one who could doctor video footage." He pulled out his phone and pressed play. The screen showed James and Victoria in his office, but this time the footage was clear, unedited, and damning. James's face went pale. "Where did you get that? My mother may not approve of Rachel, but she despises you even more. She had her own investigators watching you for months." Back in the conference room, Rachel faced Victoria. "You really don't understand, do you? This isn't about reputations or scandals. It's about right and wrong." "Don't be naive," Victoria scoffed. "There is no right and wrong in our world. There's only power and money." "That's where you're wrong." Rachel stood straighter. And that's why you lost Ethan in the first place. The wedding music began to play, floating up from the grand ballroom below. Victoria checked her phone and frowned. James should have texted by now. Suddenly the door burst open. It was Ethan, followed by 2 police officers. "Victoria Bennett," one officer said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and embezzlement." Victoria's face went from shock to fury. "You!" She pointed at Rachel. "This is your fault." "No, Victoria," Ethan said. "It's yours. The FBI has been watching your accounts for weeks. They know about the money you and James were planning to steal. They know everything." More commotion erupted from downstairs. James was being led out in handcuffs through the crowd of shocked wedding guests. Camera flashes went off as reporters who'd come to cover a society wedding found themselves with a much bigger story. Margaret Carlyle appeared in the doorway. "Rachel," she said, "I owe you an apology. I thought you were after Ethan's money, his position. I was wrong." "Mrs. Carlyle, please, call me Margaret." She smiled slightly. "Anyone who helps save my son's company and keeps him from marrying that woman twice deserves to be on a first-name basis." As Victoria was led away by the police, she turned back one last time. "You know you don't belong in his world," she said to Rachel. "You never will." "You're right," Rachel replied. "I don't belong in your world of schemes and betrayals, but that's not Ethan's world anymore." The hotel was chaos. Guests were leaving in shocked groups, reporters were shouting questions, and somewhere, a wedding planner was having a nervous breakdown over all the wasted preparations. In the midst of it all, Ethan pulled Rachel into a quiet corner. "I never got to finish what I was trying to say last night. Ethan, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He took both her hands in his. "For years, I thought I needed someone like Victoria, someone who understood the game of power and money. But what I really needed was someone who reminded me there's more to life than games. Someone who showed me what real loyalty looks like. Someone who made me want to be better." Rachel's heart was pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you. Not because you helped me stop Victoria and James, not because you stood by me through everything, but because you're you. The woman who reads to sick children at the hospital on her lunch breaks, who remembers everyone's birthday in the office, who sees the best in people even when they don't deserve it." Tears spilled down Rachel's cheeks. "I love you too. I have for so long." When they kissed, there were no cameras, no reporters, no shocked society gossips watching. For that moment, they were just Ethan and Rachel, finally finding their way to each other. Later, as they left the hotel hand in hand, Margaret said something that made Rachel smile. "Well, at least we won't have to plan another wedding. All these decorations shouldn't go to waste." Ethan laughed. "Mother, we just had one scandal today. Let's not start planning another one yet." But his eyes met Rachel's, and they both knew that someday, when the time was right, they would have their own wedding. Not for show, not for society, but for love. "Let's go home," Rachel said softly. "Yes," Ethan replied. "Let's." And as they drove away from the chaos of the failed wedding, both knew that while Victoria had been wrong about many things, she'd been right about one. Rachel didn't belong in her world of manipulation and deceit. She belonged in a better world, one she and Ethan would build together. The Monday after the wedding scandal, Rachel walked into Carlyle Enterprises to find everything had changed. The security guard who'd barely noticed her for years now jumped to attention. People who'd never given her a second glance were suddenly falling over themselves to say good morning. "I don't like it," she told Ethan in his office. "They're treating me differently." "They're treating you with respect," Ethan said, looking up from his computer. "Something they should have done all along." The morning newspapers were spread across his desk, all carrying the same story. Corporate scandal exposed at society wedding. Victoria and James were facing serious charges, and the investigation was widening to include others involved in the embezzlement scheme. "The board wants to meet with us," Ethan said. "They're concerned about our relationship." Rachel's heart sank. "Maybe I should resign, find another job." "Absolutely not." Ethan stood up and walked around his desk. "I almost lost you once because of what other people thought. Never again." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Janet from HR, looking nervous. "Mr. Carlyle, there's a situation in the lobby. Your ex-wife." They found Victoria standing in the lobby, still wearing her designer clothes but looking less polished than usual. She'd been released on bail pending trial. "2 minutes," she said when she saw them. "That's all I'm asking." Rachel started to step back, but Ethan took her hand firmly in his. "You made bail," he said coldly. "James is turning on me," Victoria said, her voice shaking. "His lawyers are saying it was all my idea. Ethan, please, You know me. You know I wouldn't— I thought I knew you, Ethan interrupted. I was wrong. Victoria's eyes shifted to Rachel. You must be happy now. You've got everything you wanted. No, Rachel said quietly. This isn't what anyone wanted, Victoria. But you made your choices. After Victoria left, escorted out by security, Rachel noticed Ethan's hand was trembling slightly in hers. No matter what Victoria had done, seeing her like this had affected him. Are you okay? She asked softly. I will be. He squeezed her hand. As long as you're here. But their challenges weren't over. That afternoon, Rachel overheard two executives talking in the break room. It's inappropriate, one was saying. She was his secretary. How do we know this whole relationship isn't a scandal waiting to happen? Watch your mouth, a sharp voice interrupted. It was Margaret Carlyle. That woman helped save this company. And more importantly, she saved my son from making the biggest mistake of his life, twice. Later that evening, as Rachel was packing up her desk, she'd be moving to a new office tomorrow, taking on a role as director of operations, her phone rang. It was her mother. Rachel Ann Turner. Her mother's voice was sharp. Why am I reading about you in the society pages? And why didn't you tell me you were dating your boss? Mum, it's complicated. Life is always complicated, sweetheart. The question is, are you happy? Rachel looked through her office window to where Ethan was talking with some board members. He caught her eye and smiled, that special smile that was just for her. Yes, she said, I really am. Then that's all that matters. But bring him to dinner on Sunday. Your father wants to have a word with him. After hanging up, Rachel laughed. From society scandals and corporate intrigue to Sunday dinner with her parents, life had certainly taken an unexpected turn. Ethan came in as she was finishing packing. Ready to go home? Almost. She pointed to the small, succulent plant on her desk, the one she'd had since her first day as his secretary. Just need to find a place for this in the new office. Actually, Ethan said, looking slightly nervous, I was thinking maybe it could go somewhere else, like my place, along with the rest of your things. Rachel's hands stilled on the box she was packing. Ethan, I know it's fast, he said quickly. And I know people will talk, but I've wasted too much time caring what other people think. I love you, Rachel. Move in with me. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with breaking news. James Thornton agrees to testify against co-conspirators in corporate fraud case. Ethan read the alert over her shoulder. Looks like Victoria's world is about to come crashing down even harder. Are you sure you're ready for all of this? Rachel asked. The scandal, the gossip, taking our relationship public? I've never been more sure of anything. He took the plant from her desk and added it to her box of belongings. So what do you say? Ready to start our own scandal? Rachel looked at the man she'd loved for so long, now finally free to love her back. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. As they left the office together, Rachel thought about how much had changed in just a few days. She'd gone from being the invisible secretary to the woman who helped expose a major corporate scandal, from loving Ethan in secret to building a future with him. But even as they stepped into their new life together, storm clouds were gathering. Because Victoria wasn't done fighting, and James's decision to testify would set in motion a chain of events that would test their love in ways they never expected. 6 months after the wedding that never was, Rachel stood in front of a mirror in another bridal suite at the Grand Plaza Hotel. This time, she was the one wearing white. You look beautiful, sweetheart, her mother said, adjusting Rachel's veil. Though I still think 6 months is awfully fast. When you know, Margaret Carlyle chimed in, surprising everyone. Over the past months, she'd become one of Rachel's strongest supporters, especially after Rachel's handling of the crisis that had nearly destroyed Carlyle Enterprises. The door opened and a hotel staff member hurried in. Miss Turner, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent. Rachel knew who it was before the door opened again. Victoria stood there thinner than before, wearing a simple dress instead of her usual designer clothes. Could we have a moment? Victoria asked. After everyone left, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. I'm not here to cause trouble, Victoria said finally. I'm here to warn you. About what? James. Victoria twisted her hands together. The plea deal fell through. He's desperate, and he blames Ethan for everything. Rachel's heart raced. What are you saying? He escaped custody this morning. No one knows where he is. Victoria stepped closer. I know you have no reason to trust me, but James is dangerous when he's cornered, and this wedding, it's too perfect a target. Before Rachel could respond, shouts erupted from outside. The fire alarm began blaring and smoke started seeping under the door. "He's here," Victoria whispered. Rachel kicked off her heels and hiked up her wedding dress. "We need to get everyone out." They ran into the hallway to find chaos. Smoke was pouring from several rooms, and panicked guests were running everywhere. "Rachel!" Ethan's voice cut through the confusion. He was fighting his way toward her through the crowd. "It's James," she called out. "Victoria warned me." A figure emerged from the smoke behind Ethan. James, his expensive suit dirty and torn, his eyes wild. "You ruined everything," he snarled, raising something in his hand. A gun. "No." Victoria threw herself forward, knocking into James just as he fired. The bullet hit the ceiling as hotel security tackled him. In the aftermath, as James was led away in handcuffs, again, Rachel found Victoria sitting alone in the hotel garden. "Thank you," Rachel said simply. Victoria smiled sadly. "I owed you both that much." She stood up. "Be happy, Rachel. Be better than I was." An hour later, after the smoke had cleared and the excitement had died down, Rachel walked down the aisle toward Ethan. Their wedding was smaller now, more intimate, with half the decorations smoke damaged. But as Rachel looked at the faces around her, her parents beaming proudly, Margaret Carlyle dabbing at her eyes, even their employees who'd become like family, she knew this was exactly the wedding they were meant to have. "Ready to be Mrs. Carlyle?" Ethan whispered as she reached him. Rachel smiled. "I'm keeping my name, Turner Carlyle. Remember, we agreed." "We did." His eyes sparkled. "Just like we agreed you're taking over as CEO when I step down next year." "One scandal at a time," she whispered back, making him laugh. That evening, at their reception, Margaret clinked her glass for a toast. "When Ethan first married, I thought I knew what was best for him. I thought I knew what kind of woman should stand beside the CEO of Carlyle Enterprises." She smiled at Rachel. "I was wrong. What my son needed, what this company needed, wasn't another socialite playing power games. It was someone with integrity, intelligence, and real strength. Someone who could remind us all that success isn't just about money and power. It's about the people we love and the good we can do in the world." Later, as they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Rachel thought about how far they'd come, from secretary and boss to partners in every way. They'd faced corporate intrigue, family disapproval, scandal, and even an attempted wedding crasher with a gun. But through it all, their love had only grown stronger. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, holding her close. "About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best things in life," she said. "If Victoria hadn't left you, if she hadn't invited you to her wedding, if I hadn't been too blind to see what was right in front of me all along," he finished. As they danced, Rachel caught a glimpse of a familiar figure slipping out of the reception. Victoria, leaving quietly without causing the scene everyone had feared. Maybe she too had learned something about love and redemption. "So," Ethan said, pulling Rachel's attention back to him, "ready to build that better world we talked about?" Rachel looked around at their gathered loved ones, at the life they were starting together. "We already have," she said, and kissed him. And this time, when the society photographers captured the moment, it wasn't for any scandal, it was simply to record the happy ending that turned out to be just the beginning, the end.